another episode of MFA Writers. I'm your host, Jared McCormick, and I've been really excited the last few weeks to see both returning listeners from Season 1 and new listeners tuning in for Season 2. If you've been around over the past year, then you probably already know this, but I wanted to take a moment to encourage any new listeners out there to reach out to us if you have a school you'd really like to see featured. We really do take those requests seriously. This episode today, for example, was requested by Victor DeBianchi and Amy Peltz. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. Feel free to just shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms, or you can send us an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you would leave a review, preferably on Apple Podcasts. It only takes a few minutes, but doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today I'm with Ashley Sojin Kim. Ashley received her MFA from the University of Florida and her BA from Johns Hopkins University. Her work appears or is forthcoming in Literary Matters, Faultline Journal, Rhino Poetry, Spoon River Poetry Review, and elsewhere. Her honors and awards include a Pushcart Prize nomination and fellowships from Kundiman and the Napa Valley Writers Conference. Today, Ashley has brought 3 poems to read for us.
Great, thank you for that. The first poem I'll be reading is called Swan Song. The laurel, born of Daphne's plea, remains a wreathed accolade, with glossy leaves arrayed around. The open-voweled crowns like hollow reeds, Pan's makeshift pipes that sigh with zephyrs, yet another story marked by the pursuit of gods and shallow grief enshrined in precious symbols, serving those who fashioned them. But honest love is not lost ardor. Think on sorrow held in curls of tender hyacinth, Apollo's blue, revered as a lover weeping promises, in springtime blooms, as mute swans draw the half-full chariot to sacred lands and sing sweet melodies of faithfulness to death. Alphacinas. The town of Lisbon, unsurprisingly, is Porto's rival. Their geographic closeness creates shared qualities. Both coastal cities boast neighborhoods whose snaking alleys, fading ochre facades, and ancient churches breathe medieval histories. While Gaia's banks are lined with port-maturing lodges, Lisbon is home to Fado's melancholic airs, performed in living-room-sized restaurants that fill bellies with lore and steamed whitefish. Just off of bumpy cobbled roads, Cape-clad tunas strum folk tunes till the city glows with nightlife's neon signage. Navy-black skies yield to dawn. Dense fog creeps in beside the trams whose 19th century roots remain unchanged. The Tagus flows seaward as always. My final poem is Sea Woman. Bodies strewn across rocky soil like freshly pulled radishes, white and lifeless, now buried under 9-hole courses and honeymoon suites with marble floors. Sparkling knives stole through Pukchon 50 years ago. Jeju is known for folk culture, citrus, trees stunted by sea winds, and freediving Henya scouring dark underworlds for abalone. A dying tradition of old women who have seen torched homes, infants' graves, villagers corralled into schoolyards, or fleeing to cave-studded hills. Daughters who never learned to swim. Their seaside shelters are littered with shellfish carcasses and bottles of painkillers. The sea women sing of diving with coffins on their heads.
Ashley, that was great. Thanks so much for reading. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, first, I want to talk about the last poem you read, Sea Women. I read this and I was blown away by it, not just because it's beautifully written, but also because I did not know about this history, about these killings that took place in Jeju. I lived in South Korea for a couple of years and traveled to Jeju several times while I was there. And there may have been vague references to things that happened in the past, but this history was not something that was openly talked about. So can you tell us a bit about the events that took place on Jeju in the late 40s, how and when you first learned about them, and why you wanted to write about them?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm not an expert on Korean history, and honestly, this poem was my kind of attempt to try to learn more and process this while I was learning it. But kind of long story short, during this time, the Korean government, which was backed by the U.S. government because it was set up after the war and things like that, was very anti-communist, and anyone who was kind of seen as being against the U.S.-backed military dictatorship of South Korea at the time was considered kind of a red, commie, red, whatever. But it was also a lot of Korean independence movements, so those were considered communist as well, because those people wanted Korea to be an independent country free of, like U.S. colonial forces in the area. And so all of these people who were considered communist were then attacked, massacred, etc. And so in doing my own research, there are a lot of other similar uprisings or massacres, the most prevalent probably being the Gwangju massacre. But I stumbled upon this poem by E.J. Ko, who's another Korean-American poet, who wrote her one collection and then a memoir actually recently, but she wrote a poem called Jeju Island, in which she talks a little bit about the massacre, and she doesn't touch on it too much. Her poem is very short as well, but I think she had a personal connection to the events that transpired on the island. I think her grandfather or someone lived on Jeju during this time. And so when I read that, that was kind of my first venture into this history, and I just became really fascinated with it. And again, with other massacres during that time, and even talking to my parents about this kind of thing. My parents were teenagers at the time that these massacres were happening, which seems so crazy to me because they seem like such faraway events, wartime events that we didn't really live through, but my parents were very aware of, and it was just insane to hear their personal accounts of it after having read about it online. And they shared with me that they didn't know anything about what was happening in Gwangju or these other things. Like you were saying, kind of the government didn't speak openly about these atrocities really. And all people knew was that no one really was allowed to come in or out of Gwangju for that specific massacre and event. And there have been, tons of movies made about it since then. And I think just in the past few years or so, maybe 10, I'm not really sure, but now the Korean government has kind of acknowledged these things that have happened. I think if you visit Jeju nowadays, you can go to a small museum or memorial or something of the sort and learn about this. But yeah, I mean, Jeju Island is known for tourism. Super, just like people go there for vacation. So the honeymoon suites and, resorts and things that are mentioned in my poem. That was my first impression of Jeju as well, because I went as a child to visit and we stayed at this nice resort, which was on the beach, and it was beautiful. And, we rode horses and ate the tangerines that they're known for and all that other stuff. So it's very interesting just because it has all this history. And then it's really hasn't been talked about since, extensively, or it's kind of been covered up by these other tourist and vacation sites.
Right. Like I said, I traveled there 2 or 3 times when I was living in South Korea as a tourist, and I didn't see anything about this. And then I love that you read a poem that made you look into it and write your own poem. And then I read your poem and it got me looking into it. So we're just really paying the history forward here. But essentially what happened, right, is there was a group of farmers who wanted to establish independence, and the government came in and killed all of them, essentially. And so it is like one of those historical events that needs to be talked about, right? People need to know about it, but so few people do. Even today, I think, even though you said there's a small museum there, that's not something that I even knew existed when I went there. I would have went and I would have checked it out. But one thing I did know about from going to Jeju was the Haenyeo women, the women divers who are quite celebrated in Jeju and around Korea. But for any listeners who haven't heard of them, could you tell us about the Haenyeo and why they inspired you to write this poem?
Yeah, so the Haenyeo weren't originally something that I was thinking of when I started writing this poem, but basically Haenyeo are female divers. Jeju is an interesting kind of community within Korea. Well, first of all, it's like separate from the mainland, but also their society is largely matriarchal because of the Haenyeo. So the Haenyeo are women divers who dive kind of without any equipment, but I think they have wetsuits and things like that. But they dive and harvest, mollusks, oysters, abalone, things like that. And they're basically the breadwinners of their families. So they're very just famous. They're one of Korea's like cultural, treasures, I guess, because it is such a unique occupation. But yeah, originally I wasn't thinking about them really when I was writing this poem because I was just so horrified by the massacres. But then I thought about it some more and realized that they would have been around while this was all happening. And so that was really interesting to me because, the stereotypical image of a Haenyeo is like an older woman who probably is a grandmother. And they're doing this manual labor. They're in the sun, they're diving, their skin is very exposed to the natural elements. So when you see pictures of Haenyeo, they have all these wrinkles, their skin is very tan. It's not what you would, I call them Korean mermaids for myself. But in reality, like they're not really the embodiment of, what you would think of as a typical mermaid. I feel like mermaids are associated with, beauty, like traditional ideas of beauty, but these women are beautiful in that they are very strong. They are very matriarchal. And they have all this history, which is then ostensibly linked to the history of Jeju Island. And having been there and having witnessed all of these things, after kind of thinking about it, I told myself I could not put them in the poem. And it's kind of, I call it a dying tradition in the poem because it is. I don't think many younger women are really captivated by the idea of going into this profession where, things are done manually. I think they only have a few tools when they're going down and diving. When, things have been, quote unquote, modernized and this could be done some other way. But yeah, so it's a dying tradition in that way. And then also it's very, very taxing on the body. Whatever they have, they take painkillers from what I understand. Definitely takes a toll on the body. And that line about them singing of diving with coffins on their heads is kind of like, I did some research on that too. And it's just, when people go to work and sing songs, that's like one of the lines. It's a little bleak, to be fair, but it is kind of their reality too. So that's kind of how that's all connected. And I thought that was really interesting.
It is super interesting. It's amazing that anyone free dives without like scuba equipment, but these are like elderly women who have been like free diving in South Korea for years. And then, so that in and of itself is fascinating. And then also this history that most people don't know about is fascinating, and finding a way to link those. And the idea that these women were alive when this happened and have since just continued to do their job and maybe have not had the opportunity to talk about what happened to them. Right? Yeah. Because it's not something that's openly talked about.
Yeah. There is a lot of death present in this poem as kind of a theme, but at the same time, there is some hope through the Haenyeo. And I think a question that you had raised was how are the killings kind of related to Haenyeo and things like that? And I would say also that the act of harvesting from the ocean is a type of killing that the Haenyeo do, that the Haenyeo participate in, but as a means of survival. And I think that survival is also a big theme that's running through this poem, as they have remained, and they are still, like you said, working and going about their normal daily lives. So I thought that was like, they're just so resilient. And I think that resilience is kind of a note that I wanted to leave in there.
I think it's a fascinating connection that you're making there. And you told me before the interview that you're obsessed with the relationship between things. And a lot of your poems contain a kind of conflation rather than telling a story. Is this connection you made in Sea Women what you were referring to when you said that?
Yeah, definitely. Like I was saying before, I really did not plan this poem to have both the massacre and the Sea Women, in the same piece. And I just, like, thinking about it, I couldn't not put them in the same poem and just kind of leave it up to the reader to figure out, why they're in there, what connects them. And I think that's kind of what I mean. I'm obsessed with observing things and putting things side by side, kind of exactly how I perceive them, I guess, without knowing of an explicit connection. But just thinking about it and letting it sit there in my mind or sit there on the page and seeing like what comes up. And I think that's actually more conducive to thinking about things on a deeper level rather than, telling people, okay, this is what I want you to do with these two different things. I think I really enjoy like pairing things or seeing what new things can arise out of these kinds of connections.
Absolutely. And I think like putting those two things side by side and asking the reader to think about both of them in a similar context elevates both of them and like elevates those aspects of them that are similar and also the parts that are different. I mean, I really love this poem a lot. And then it seems to happen again in the poem Alfacinha, in which you draw connections between Lisbon and Porto and Portugal. So how do these types of poems usually start for you? Like you said in this one that you weren't thinking about those connections beforehand, but are there times when you write poems in which you're connecting to things that you're thinking about those connections when you sit down to write the poem? Or is it usually you're just thinking about one and somehow your mind wanders to this other thing?
Yeah, I would say it's probably a mix of both. Maybe I start off usually with thinking about one thing, and then kind of as I'm doing research, I find other things that kind of make sense to weave in. So with Sea Woman, it was definitely that. I think with Alfacinas, it was probably the latter, where I had kind of wanted to set up this dichotomy between Lisbon and Porto, and see where that would take me. But I think most of the time it's just, I'm like single-minded. So most of the time it's just me going for one thing and layering it with other things. Even though sometimes, even if I do see a comparison that is really interesting to me, I'll just make a note of it in my notes app on my phone, just so I don't forget it. So I can kind of see like, okay, this is very interesting. It's something that I would like to explore a little bit more.
How writers lived without the notes app in their phone.
I have no idea. Pen and paper, probably.
I would be terrified of losing my notebook all the time.
Exactly.
But then the third poem you read, Swan Song, has a much different feel to it than the other two, to me. Is that poem a departure of sorts from this kind of connecting of themes and objects that you usually do in your poems?
Yeah, I would say so. Swan Song I definitely think of as more lyrical than the other two. I think the other two have more of a narrative leaning, or maybe like a descriptive leaning. But Swan Song definitely, I went into it kind of thinking, okay, how can I went in with a theme in mind. So my theme was kind of like, oh, there are all these love stories or conquest stories or lust stories, I guess, that are present in Greek mythology. And I wanted to find, at least one instance of genuine love where it wasn't subversive or kind of forced in any way, where it was like a genuine relationship. So the one I ended up finding was the one between Apollo and Hyacinth. Yeah, which was a really beautiful story. Just and compared to all these other stories, which maybe are more well known, such as with Daphne, who she was chased by Apollo also, but she just wanted to be left alone, so she pleaded to be made into a tree. And then same with the Zephyr story where Pan was really pursuing this nymph, and she wanted to be made into reeds instead of being pursued. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of, I think I did want to still compare these stories and kind of put them next to each other to say, okay, this is kind of like the first two that I mentioned. I have an opinion on them, like a negative opinion on them. And then the last one I think was the more hopeful note of, okay, this can like true, genuine and innocent love can exist in these mythologies, if we let them. So that's kind of how that came about. But that was definitely, I came in with a theme in mind. So I was looking for stories that kind of fit those ideas.
I agree that like this one definitely has more of a lyrical song-like voice to it, more so than the other two. So it's interesting to me that you came into this one with a theme already in mind. Do you think that affects the voice at all? Like with the first two, you're just trying to explore and find connections between these two things, where in this one you had a theme in mind. Do you think that affects your voice at all when you sit down to write, like knowing what the theme's going to be beforehand?
Yeah, definitely. So because I had the theme of kind of Greek mythology in mind, Greek mythology being the big capital G, capital M Greek mythology.
Yeah, right.
I decided to write in iambic pentameter, and I enjoy writing in verse as well. So I always like that challenge. I find that verse often pushes me in ways that writing in free verse doesn't really allow me to, or doesn't push me to do. And so, yeah, I wrote in verse, and then also because it was about love, I kind of not arbitrarily, but I made it 14 lines. So a sonnet length, even though it's not a traditional sonnet with a rhyme scheme or anything like that. And then I also just wanted to put another restriction on myself. This one was maybe arbitrary, but I'm trying to make it into one sentence. So I kind of made the form stricter, so that I could kind of fit it into this more lyrical, more capital G, capital M Greek mythology theme.
How do you find that adding restrictions to yourself as you're writing a poem affects your writing?
Yeah, so I enjoy it. I think it's fun. It adds another element of like, oh, it's me as a poet as I'm writing it, but then how do I not come off as, oh, this is me trying to do this thing? And I think that just comes with, a lot of practice and having written in forms before. But I think sometimes also when I'm feeling stuck, I'll try to put something in a form, which I know might sound counterintuitive to some people who struggle writing form. But I think when I'm stuck on ideas, form can actually be the thing that pushes me to go in a different direction. And I don't know if I should be admitting this as a poem, but the rhyme dictionary or like rhyme zone is definitely very helpful. It tells you exactly like, it can give you a rhyme based on the stressed and unstressed syllables as well, which is super helpful to me. But anyways, yeah, it just makes me pull words that might not have been in the lexicon that I was thinking of at the time, especially with rhyme, but also with meter, because then with meter, there are line breaks to think of. And I kind of cheated with the half full in the third to last line of this, but I have a hyphen in between half and full to make it fit the meter. But I think it's like a challenge. I think meter is always something that when I was teaching too, it's something that I force my students to at least try to see if they would like it, or to see what things that it would limit for them, but also what things that it would open up. Because I think it's misunderstood as something that can seem limited, can feel very limited and constricting, but I think when you can pull it off, it's actually very beautiful and fun. It can be fun in the process too.
Well, I hear from a lot of people that the MFA gave them the space to try out new things. So while you were in the MFA program, did you find yourself experimenting more in the ways that you approached and wrote your poems?
Yeah, definitely. I think form was one way where I experimented. We weren't ever really required to write in form at my MFA program, but we had people who were very familiar with form, like William Logan and Angie Mlinko were very well versed, no pun intended, in formal writing as well. So that was really good to be able to see that, and then also learning more about other forms. such as the Korean shijo is a kind of 3-line form, I think, with 14, 16, and 14 syllables, and kind of trying to experiment with that, but using English, which is, I think always trying to write in a form in a different language than which the form originated in is an interesting challenge, because each language, like English is accentual syllabic, so that's why it's easy to have those the IMs or whatever it is, because naturally it does follow that pattern. But for other languages such as Korean, which is more syllabic and less accentual, or even Japanese, which has the haiku, which is also Japanese, I feel like is less accentual and just more syllabic. I think it's really interesting to try to figure out how to still do well for the form and, with using a different language entirely.
I hadn't even thought about that like, writing in a certain form, like a form that started in one language and writing in another language in that form, it must be super challenging, but it sounds fun. It sounds like a fun challenge, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And another thing that you told me is that you've tried to write longer poetry, but that you've found that kind of challenging. All 3 of the poems you read today are fairly short. In what ways do you think the two are different from a process standpoint, writing short poetry or writing long poetry? And what is it about it, the long poetry, do you think that you find so challenging?
Well, for me, it might just be me personally, but I think a short poem is probably the most that I can process at one time, just like as a writer, as a reader, because, in poetry, different from fiction, each word kind of carries its own weight. And so I feel like going into longer forms is difficult for me because I feel like everything kind of has to make sense with each other. And for me, it's kind of hard to keep that same line of thought or the same concerns present in the beginning as they are in the end. But maybe I don't need to worry about that so much. And just, I don't know. I've always wanted to write a long poem, but I feel like the only long poems that I've kind of been able to write are ones in shorter sections, if that makes sense. So that's kind of my way of cheating around that. But I think I'm always very in awe of people who can write long poems, and especially longer kind of narrative poems. I feel like that's one reason I kind of shy away from fiction, or I'm very impressed with fiction writers because they can have these long narratives that build upon each other. But I think for me, each image or each word in the poem is so, it carries so much weight by itself already that too many of those can become a little bit overwhelming for myself personally. Though I do enjoy reading long poems, and I do have read some really great long poems as well. Just for me, I don't think I'm quite there yet.
Well, something to still work on. We all have plenty to work on. And, maybe now that you're done with the MFA program, you have some little extra time maybe to work on your longer poetry, because you just graduated from the MFA program at the University of Florida, which is a 3-year fully funded program with tracks in fiction and poetry. Each year, the program accepts 6 students in each genre, so there are usually about 36 students in the program at one time, according to the website. So what drew you to the University of Florida?
Well, the biggest thing was funding. So I applied. I knew I wanted to get an MFA, and then my advisor in undergrad told me that if I wanted some kind of a choice, that I should apply to 20, which is a lot of MFA programs to apply to, but I listened to him. Thank you, James Arthur, if you're listening. But I applied to 20 schools, and out of the 20, I got into a couple. And out of the couple, I got into maybe 2 programs that were fully funded. So, I think Florida was the more appealing of the 2. But also, it's a great program. I think it was very similar to Johns Hopkins, where I went, in a similar like aesthetics, similar concerns, very academic, which I was interested in. And I mean, William Logan called me probably every day after I got my acceptance to ask me if I was coming or not. So a little peer pressure maybe from him made me want to go. But I mean, there's great faculty, William Logan, Angie Mlinko, and Michael Hoffman. And I just felt that I had a lot to learn from all of them, having, read some of their work, and not just their poems, but also critical work. William is kind of notorious for his reviews. And some of Angie's reviews, Michael's reviews and translations and things like that. So it seemed like all of the faculty were kind of very invested in not only writing poems, but being engaged with the, larger literary world, which I think sometimes poets just focus on poetry, and that can be good for a while, but then I think it's also very important to be a part of the larger community as well.
So you mentioned that the funding at Florida was pretty good. What did the funding look like when you were attending?
Yeah, the funding when I was attending was a full tuition waiver plus a stipend, which we got from teaching. And then teaching was another thing that appealed to me because I had wanted to try it out and see if that was something that I wanted to do in the future. And just for updates on funding, it's still tuition waiver and stipend, but actually because of COVID and a bunch of funding was cut from, I think, probably most departments at the university. I think this year they only accepted 3 poets and 3 fiction writers, but they chose to do that instead of lowering the funding because when the funding is guaranteed, that kind of serves the purpose of the program more. So you don't really have to worry about, getting another job or supplementing living expenses in some way. So you can really focus on the writing. I think they have stayed true to that.
So how much was the stipend?
The stipend was, I think it increases a little bit every year due to, inflation, cost of living. But when I was there, it was around $18,000 a year, or $18,000 for 9 months. So a lot of people also try to pick up teaching in the summer and things like that, which sounds low, but for the cost of living in Gainesville, Florida, it is very doable. In terms of living and groceries and all that stuff.
So when I was poking around on the website, one thing they mentioned is that students are responsible for about $750 per semester in fees, which I appreciate that they put that on their website because some programs don't put that on their website. And then you get there and find out that there are all these fees you have to pay.
Yes.
So it's good to know that up front. And then I'm curious if there are other fees that you have to pay or if the school provides health insurance to you all or if that's something that you have to pay for on your own.
Yeah, definitely. So fees, it was $700, but I think with the graduate assistant union, actually they lowered it to about $500 per semester now, which is good. They're still pushing for it to be, fee free because the work to pay model is not really great for graduate assistants who are already working like a lot. So that's the only fee. And then health insurance, you can elect to do health insurance. I think it's only $10 per month, but it's very good. Comes with like vision and dental. Oh, actually, I'm not sure about vision, but dental. I got 2 free checkups there and cleaning and stuff like that. So the healthcare is $10, which it's not very much, and it's very good.
And you mentioned teaching. So what was the workload like and what kind of classes were you teaching when you were there?
So the teaching kind of varies from year to year. The first year, everyone teaches 2 sections of kind of introductory writing. One of them is just a kind of gen ed introduction to composition and rhetoric. And the other class is writing for engineers. Because engineers also need to learn how to write in their fields and write reports and stuff like that. So the first year of teaching, honestly, I would say is not very exciting. But one of the benefits of the first year is that you co-teach with 2 other people. So there will be 1 mentor and then 2 first-year students, whether in the MFA or the PhD program, because the MFA is within the English department. So that's what the teaching looks like for the first year. And then for the second year, we are able to teach introductory poetry or fiction classes, depending which genre you're in, as well as teaching, I think, 1 semester of the introductory writing classes again. But the poetry class, it was really great to be able to kind of do that. There is kind of a template that you have to follow for the syllabus, with the university and department mandated learning goals and requirements and a couple of, I think 1 or 2 required textbooks. But other than that, the syllabus was really up to us to make. It's reviewed by the head of the department, the director of graduate student teaching. But what we assign to our students to read and things like that were very open to us. The only other restriction on that was the word requirement. So these intro classes all fulfill like a 6,000 word university writing requirement. So we had to have our assignments meet that requirement. But other than that, it was pretty flexible, and you can kind of make the class into whatever theme that you want to, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, it sounds fun. And then besides teaching, you also had the opportunity to work for Subtropics, which is University of Florida's literary magazine. What was that experience like? What kind of responsibilities did you have?
Yeah, so my responsibilities mainly were reading through submissions and kind of voting up the ones that I thought or I liked or resonated with in some way. And then there was another intern at the same time who was like a second eye. So we kind of, after we went through all of them individually, we went through the ones that we had chosen amongst ourselves, and then sent those to Angie Malenko, who was in charge of the poetry side of things. So that was really cool. And it was honestly kind of crazy because our submissions were only open for, I think, 4 days this year. But we still got over 1,000 submissions, which is insane. But we got through all of them, and then we sent them over. And then another cool thing that we were able to do was to interview one of the writers that we chose. Just an interview that we would publish in the magazine and on the website as well. So that was really cool. And that process was kind of interesting too, because originally, so we got submissions from Submittable, like most people. And then we also have some submissions, I think, that either are solicited or that are sent through literary agents and things like that. So when I was choosing someone to interview, I think I chose someone who came not through Submittable, but through one of those other avenues. And then it turns out that they actually elected for their poem to be published somewhere else. So I actually had to choose someone else to interview, which I was a little bit bummed about. But it ended up being really good. And I interviewed Matthew Buckley Smith, who is also a poet. And I think his second book just won some prize. The name's escaping me right now, but he's a really fantastic poet. And he also went to Hopkins for his MFA. So there was kind of a connection there, but it was really interesting to interview him. And we talked a lot about form because all of the poems that he had submitted were in form. And he also started a poetry podcast as well called Slee Ricketts, if anyone is interested in listening to that. But it was really cool to be able to just talk to him and to even talk about some of our professors that we'd had at Hopkins and things like that. So that was a very cool experience.
Yeah, it sounds really fun. And you mentioned there was another intern. So is it usually like 2 MFA students can work for Subtropics each semester or a year? How does that work?
Yeah, I think it's 2 MFA students per genre that work on the issue each semester. So I think just so that everyone who wants to have a chance to work on a magazine can. It's usually like two poetry interns, 2 fiction interns, and then like they switch out each semester.
And did your work for Subtropics replace some of your teaching workload, or was this in addition to that?
It didn't replace teaching workload, but it did count as kind of an elective. So one other thing about the University of Florida is that we have to take, in addition to our MFA-specific coursework, we have to take 3 seminars in the English department. And then we also have to take, I think it's 3 electives. So that can be a forms class in the other genre, or an extra forms class in your genre, or Subtropics, or like an independent study kind of thing. So
working for Subtropics, what were like some of your biggest takeaways from being on the other side of the submission process?
I think I would have to say that it really gave me a good insight into what people were writing or what people were interested in writing about. I think if they cared enough to submit in the 4-day submission period, like all of these people really cared about their work and things like that. But we got such a wide range of topics that I didn't even know that people were writing about, which was a really good perspective to gain, I think, because in a program, I think every program kind of has their own flavor or their own aesthetic preferences. So it can kind of feel like a bubble at times, even though, people in your program may be, are interested in writing about other topics than you. I think at the end of the day, it kind of, you're kind of used to what people are writing. So it was really a nice, it felt very fresh to read all of these submissions that were really about anything. Sometimes after reading a submission, I was like, I wrote a note in my notes app and I said, maybe this is definitely something that I want to think about more, or this is something I want to look into more as well. That was really cool.
Well, you mentioned how sometimes the MFA programs can feel a bit like a bubble. And you told me before the interview that one thing that you really love is making connections with people in the larger writing community. It sounds like when you were working at Subtropics, you got the chance to interview this poet. That sounds really cool. So in what other ways have you been able to make connections with writers that are outside of the University of Florida program?
Yeah, so Subtropics was a great opportunity to do that. And the poet that I interviewed actually also read for Literary Matters, which is the other literary magazine that I recently had a poem in. But so then I got to know some people through that. And then also I've done one virtual poetry festival. And then I'm supposed to do one go to one in person next week. But I did the Palm Beach Poetry Festival, which is based in Palm Beach, Florida, but it was all online. And I met a lot of people through that. I also got to work with Vivi Francis, who's amazing. And it was really nice to see poets in other walks of life, some people in MFA, some people not in MFA, some people post MFA and all of that kind of stuff, to see like what a writerly community looked like outside of school. And that was really interesting too. I met someone through that festival who also was on the masthead for Literary Matters. So I was like, all these weird connections. But I think the writing world is fairly small. So that's bound to happen at points. But I've also kept in touch with some others. And we used to have like a monthly workshop kind of group or writing group. And we met on Zoom, which I think people have been a little bit busy. So we haven't met in a couple of months, but it's just been good to, see what people are doing, kind of make connections in that way, but also, again, with like the different writing styles and things like that, I think it was helpful to learn from Vivi Francis as well, because her concerns were different from the concerns of some of the professors that I had at the University of Florida, and just pushed me to write in different ways that I hadn't really explored before. I think one of the first prompts that she gave us was to think about the top 3 emotions that drive you when you're writing. And then secondly, to think about your top 3 obsessions, and then kind of write a poem based on, some kind of combination of any of those things, which was really cool because I don't think anyone had ever told me in an academic setting, write a poem about your emotions. I think generally also, especially as beginning writers, people are discouraged from doing that because then it can get kind of, overly, sentimental or something like that. So it was really nice to be able to be free to explore that kind of way of going into something. And then I have another festival coming up next week, which I'm really excited to go to. And my workshop leader is Victoria Chang. And then also because it's in Napa, which is kind of close to San Francisco. It's in the Bay Area as well. So hopefully I'll get to meet other Bay Area writers and, get connected that way as well.
I'm always fascinated by the different prompts that writers come up with when you go to these festivals. And I think it's good advice, right, to anyone who's listening and trying to figure out how to network. These kind of writing festivals and conferences can be a really great way to meet people. And speaking of writing festivals, there is an annual Writers Festival at the University of Florida. And according to the website, the program also brings in editors and agents each year to visit and hold manuscript conferences with students. What were these experiences like for you?
Yeah, definitely. So the Writers Festival is in the fall, and it's less of kind of like what you think of having workshop every day, but it's called Writers Fest. But basically we invite a couple of writers to come and give readings and kind of craft talks throughout the weekend. And that's always really cool because, we've had writers that we actually, as MFA students, get to suggest writers that we would like to come. And then, depending on budget or who responds or who is available, we'll get the final list that way. But we've had Henri Cole, Cynthia Zarin, Yi Yun Lee, Ada Limon. Like, we've had some amazing writers come, and we get to talk to them, and we always get to kind of have a meal with at least one of them, get to know them and talk to them about their poems, their writing, and just get to know them as people. So that's always a really cool experience, and their readings are always great. Craft talks as well, really great. So it's a good opportunity to, meet writers that you really admire, because we do get to suggest their writers, and then we vote on them as well. And I think when COVID hit, we weren't able to have it that time, but I think those writers are coming this fall, maybe, pending other COVID developments. But yeah. And then the editors, we call it Editors Weekend in the spring, where the either agents, usually agents are for fiction because poets don't really have agents, but agents or like editors of prominent literary magazines will come and actually read, I think, a manuscript of 3 poems that we send them beforehand, and then they talk to us about it. So we've had the Boyers from Salmagundi come, and also David Yazzie from the Hopkins Review, Eric Smith, who is a UF alum from the Sewanee Review for poetry. For fiction, I'm not remembering the names, but also had editors come for fiction and agents. So that's always a really cool experience, because it kind of allows us to see, okay, what's beyond the MFA world. And then as we're starting to establish ourselves as emerging writers and whatnot, we can reach out to these people, connect with them, on LinkedIn or something, or send them an email. And because we did have some FaceTime with them, then they'll know us. Or even when we're submitting to magazines, we can say, hey, it was really great to meet you. Here's something I've been working on, and things like that. So those are always really cool experiences to get to put our feet into the real world outside of the MFA, and kind of just set us up for what life will maybe look like for us afterwards.
It's awesome to kind of dip your toes into that greater literary community. And I'm also curious about the general community in the University of Florida program. So how's the relationship between students there? Is it a strong community?
Yeah, definitely a strong community. We're such a small program that we can't help but be very close, and people always usually host get-togethers or some annual traditions, such as, we always have an after party after Writers Fest is over, and the writers will, I had Ada Limon in my house one year because we hosted it, and we were all just hanging out in our living room, which was pretty cool. But I would say that the program is very close-knit. First and second years have workshop together. So the first and second years and second to third years always know each other, and then kind of a little bit of a gap between third and first year, sometimes, depending on how social the third years feel like being while they're working on their theses and things like that. But a very close-knit program. I would say even with the faculty are very accessible because there aren't a lot of us, and always willing to, chat or talk about something or meet up, grab drinks, whatever. So I would say it's very close-knit, and it's a very supportive environment.
I saw on the website this thing called Friskily Bogus Introductions. What is this all about?
So that's not necessarily an official thing, but we do give MFA readings throughout the year at this bar downtown. And the introductions that are given for the writers can be very friskily bogus. For example, one time someone hired a barbershop quartet to give a musical singing introduction for someone else that he was friends with. So that's definitely the craziest thing that's ever happened during my time there. But the introductions are always, encouraged to be funny or somewhat exposing of, whoever. I had my introduction my first year. I lived with another MFA student, and she kind of gave some details to the person who was giving my introduction, I don't know, little things like what kind of shampoo I used. And I was like, oh my goodness, you've been in my house. But so that's kind of what that refers to. It's kind of a fun tradition that we have.
Well, you mentioned briefly that the community between the students and faculty is also pretty strong. On the website, it says the program has no part-time or visiting faculty, at least partially, so that the main faculty can establish relationships with students that extend well beyond office hours and workshops. So would you say that that's been your experience with the program?
Yeah, definitely. All the faculty are on or are full-time faculty. We don't really have any visiting faculty or anything like that. One interesting thing that happened while I was there, though, was that I think all three of them had some kind of sabbatical at one point. None at the same time, or maybe not all three of them, but maybe two of them, and one like the year before I got there. But I think that was coincidental. But it's nice to have three, because then you always have at least two that are always, around to help out. And even when on sabbatical, it's not like they're opposed to meeting up with students or anything. It's just that they're not, teaching in an official capacity. So I still met up with one of my faculty members, who was actually my thesis advisor during her sabbatical, and that was totally fine.
So what about the diversity of the program? Do you think the program does a good job creating a diverse and inclusive community?
Yeah, so when I went, I was the only person of color in the whole program, at least as a student, my first 2 years. And the same year that I joined the program, Akpan was joined the faculty in fiction. And I have this funny story of me and we were waiting for the elevator in our building, and I was waiting there first, and then he comes around the corner and he's like, Ashley, my fellow minority. And I just felt a sense of solidarity there with him. And just I don't know, I feel like whenever I see another person of color, it's just an immediate sense of solidarity. But in my third year, actually, the program got a lot more diverse. There was another Korean American writer who came in fiction who actually, it was so weird. Our moms knew each other from the LA area because they went to the same church. And I was like, of course this happened. And then she also knew my husband from San Francisco because that was where she was before. And I was just like, this is too weird, but I'm really happy to have you here. And then we've had a poet who's Mexican American who joined the program. Another poet, I think, who has background in Colombia. I might totally be getting that wrong, or Ecuador. And another writer who actually is an international student from India. So this year it has been a lot diversified. And I know and David Lovett from fiction are very much trying to, attract a more diverse pool of applicants. One of the difficult things I will say about that is that they read all the applications blind. So they take the name off of the applications before they read them. So unless the writer writes something specific that indicates that they are a person of color, then it's kind of hard to tell. But I mean, I've thought of, there are other ways to reach out to people. I think having on the faculty is a huge draw. We have a Nigerian writer who's coming in this fall, who I think had said that he applied because of But yeah, I think just having at least one faculty of color and then having other students of color is a big draw, the biggest draw that you can have. And then beyond that, if you're not Iowa and you don't have money to go and spend to go to other schools and have kind of info sessions like that, you can just send an email to schools and reach out. You can email HBCUs, you can email underrepresented other schools that have a large underrepresented community and stuff like that. So there are definitely ways around it, but I think it is a process that will take time. But already I've seen in the newest class that I knew that people were drawn to the program.
Well, it's good to hear that it sounds like they're working on making it more diverse. Because like you said, it is important. You mentioned the feeling of solidarity when you had another person of color in the room. So maybe you could talk to that a little bit. How does that affect your writing growth in the program, you think?
Yeah, so I think I was never one to shy away from, writing something Korean or even writing Romanized Korean or even Hangul, the alphabetized Korean in my poems and kind of experimenting with that. But I think as, people who didn't have kind of familiarity with a second language like that could sometimes, like, I sometimes wondered if the feedback that they were giving me, or a feedback that someone who was familiar with, two languages, for example, would be helpful to me as a writer. Or I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people do have like some European backgrounds that they also wrote about, and like other languages that they were familiar with that they had experimented with. But it was a little bit different coming from someone who, like, my parents speak Korean primarily, and I speak Korean with them primarily. So it's just a little different in terms of that. And I think it is helpful to bounce around ideas with other people who like understand the intersection of two cultures or maybe multiple cultures, to be able to say, okay, how do we do this in a way that isn't pandering or isn't over-explaining to a white audience, that maybe someone who is someone of color, even if they don't know the specific language, they understand, like, I don't know, that some things you don't need to understand all of it to get what they're trying to say, or kind of understand the sentiment of something before understanding the language itself. So that is something that, I think would have been helpful in the program. So when the other Korean American writer came, even though she was in fiction, I like shared my poems with her. She shared her story with me, and we were able to kind of talk to each other about, okay, am I like overdoing it here? Is this a good balance of, Korean, or like, is this cultural thing understandable to you as someone who understands this already? Even like, is naming this character does that make sense to you? It's not their actual name, but it's what I refer to them as. And even when I did the workshop with Vivi Francis, one thing that she told us, because a lot of the people in her workshop were BIPOC, and she said to stop italicizing words in a different language, because that also further otherizes the writing or the writer. And that was something that I had kind of thought about, but I kind of just defaulted to italicizing because, to indicate that it was in a different language. But then after she said that, it made me think about it. And I mean, she said not to. So I was like, okay, I will listen to you. You're much more, you've probably thought about this much more than I have. So yeah, I think just things like that, like if there had been a faculty in my program who told me that earlier on, like I could have definitely incorporated that, and things like that. And also in Florida is not very diverse. Gainesville as a city is kind of diverse just due to the fact that it is a big college town, huge university of, 60, 70,000 undergrads. But I mean, I've never lived in, I don't know if you would really consider Florida the South. It's kind of its own like entity, I feel. But, I've lived in California, I lived in Connecticut for a little bit, which was pretty white as well, but a little bit more like of the liberal white in like that area. I lived in Baltimore, which was pretty like, I mean, the area I lived in was pretty white, but also there was a huge Black community in Baltimore. And then I landed in Florida, which I was like, okay, where am I? And not even like South Florida, where there is a little bit more diversity. A lot of Cuban people in South Florida too, but in North Central Florida, which is kind of a weird spot to be in. So I think even that, and having, other people of color around me would have made it feel a little bit less of a culture shock, so to speak. But yeah, those are just some ways that it would have been nice to have other people of color in the program while I was there.
Well, this has been really fun. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And before we go, I want to give you the last word. And I was hoping you could tell us one thing you think the program does really well and one thing you think the program could do better.
Yeah, I think one thing that the program does really well is just the whole part about relationships that I kind of spoke about. I think writing is also often thought of as this individual thing, but I think it makes a huge difference to have a community of writers that supports you, that you can, bounce ideas off of and things like that. For example, in my third year, we decided to do like our own ad hoc third year workshop because third years we don't have to take the workshop class. So we just did a workshop on our own. We met every week. And it was just a nice time. I mean, we weren't always, doing workshop related things, but it was still, I think like that just speaks to the community that was fostered even before we decided to do that on our own. And, I fully intend to stay in contact with people from my cohort and my professors and things like that too, which is, I think something that University of Florida program does really well. And one thing that I think could be better is probably the diversity aspect of it. Not just like checking the diversity box by having more people that are diverse come in, which I mean is a good thing already, but also maybe reimagining the program a little bit to be more inclusive of diverse voices. For example, I don't think a lot of what we were assigned to read was necessarily, it was diverse in the sense that it was very different. Like all of the professors had different sensibilities or different writers that they liked. And we had some like international writers that we read, like Karen Soley or who's Canadian, or some European writers by way of Michael Hoffman. But I think I was kind of missing like the American writers who weren't white in my education a little bit. So I think that's something that could definitely be improved on. But also, like, one way that I kind of got around it was I assigned my students those diverse writers that I wanted to read. So I had to read it with them and talk about it with them. So I kind of got something out of assigning that as well. So yeah, that is about all I have, I think.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to stop by. Really, this has been a fantastic conversation, super informative, and your poetry is really beautiful. I can't wait to read more of it.
Thanks so much, Jared. This was really fun for me too.